How much is enough? We seem now to have disposed of all the plans except the socialist one. Before grappling with that, may I call your attention to something that happened in our examination of most of the others. We were trying to find out a sound plan of distributing money, and every time we proposed to distribute it according to personal merit or achievement or dignity or individual quality of any sort, the plan reduced itself to absurdity. When we tried to establish a relationship between money and work, we were beaten. It could not be done. When we tried to establish a relation between money and character, we were beaten. When we tried to establish a relation between money and the dignity that gives authority, we were beaten. And when we gave it up as a bad job and thought of leaving things as they are, we found that they would not stay as they are. Let us then consider for a moment what any plan must do to be acceptable. At first, as everybody except the Franciscan friars and the poor clerics will say, that no plan will be acceptable unless it abolishes poverty, and even Franciscan poverty must be voluntary and not compelled. Let us study poverty for a moment. It is generally agreed that poverty is very uncomfortable misfortune for the individual who happens to be poor. But poor people, when they are not suffering from acute hunger and severe cold, are not more unhappy than rich people. They are often much happier. Are you sure? You can easily find people who are 10 times as rich at 60 as they were at 20, but not one of them will tell you that they are 10 times as happy. Or the thoughtful ones will assure you that happiness and unhappiness are constitutional and have nothing to do with money. Money can cure hunger. It cannot cure unhappiness. Food can satisfy the appetite, but not the soul. A famous German socialist, Ferdinand Lassalle, said, Lassalle, said that what beat him in his efforts to stir up the poor to revolt against the poverty was their wantlessness. They were not, of course, content. Nobody is, but they were not discontented enough to take any serious trouble to change their condition. It may seem a fine thing to a poor woman to have a large house, plenty of servants, dozens of dresses, a lovely complexion, and beautifully dressed hair. But the rich woman who has these things often spends a good deal of her time traveling in rough places to get away from them. To have to spend 2 or 3 hours a day washing and dressing and brushing and combing and changing and being messed about generally by a lady's maid is not, on the face of it, a happier lot than to have only 5 minutes to spend on such fatigues, as the soldiers call them. Servants are so troublesome that many ladies can hardly talk about anything else when they get together. A drunken man is happier than a sober one. That is why unhappy people take to drink. There are drugs that will make you ecstatically happy whilst ruining your body and soul. It is our quality that matters. Take care of that, and our happiness will take care of it itself. 이렇게 발음이 안 되지. And our happiness will take care of itself. People of the right sort are never easy until they get things straight. But they are too healthy and too much taken up with their occupations to bother about happiness. Modern poverty is not the poverty that was blessed in the Sermon on the Mount. The objection to it is not that it makes people unhappy, but that it degrades them. And the fact that they can be quite as happy in their degradation as their betters are in their exaltation makes it worse. When Shakespeare's king said, "Then happy low, lie down. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." He forgot that happiness is no excuse for lowness. The divine spark in us flashes up against being bribed to submit to degradation by mere happiness, which a pig or a drunkard can achieve. Such poverty as we have today in all our great cities degrades the poor and infects with its degradation the whole neighborhood in which they live. And whatever can degrade a neighborhood can degrade a country and a continent and finally the whole civilized world, which is only a large neighborhood. Its bad effects cannot be escaped by the rich. When poverty produces outbreaks of virulent infectious disease, as it always does sooner or later, the rich catch the disease and see their children die of it. When it produces crime and violence, the rich go in fear of both and are put to a good deal of expense to protect their persons and property. 왜 이렇게 안 되지? When it produces bad manners and bad language, the children of the rich pick them up, no matter how carefully they are secluded. And such seclusion as they get does them more harm than good. If poor and pretty young women find, as they do, that they can make more money by vice than by honest work, they will poison the blood of rich young men who, when they marry, will infect their wives and children and cause them all sorts of bodily troubles, sometimes ending in disfigurement and blindness and death, and always doing them more or less mischief. The old notion that people can keep themselves to themselves and not be touched by what is happening to their neighbors or even to the people who live 100 miles off is a most dangerous mistake. The saying that we are members one of another is not a mere pious formula to be repeated in church without any meaning. It is a literal truth. For though the rich end of the town can avoid living with the poor end, it cannot avoid dying with it when the plague comes. People will be able to keep themselves to themselves as much as they please when they have made an end of poverty. End of poverty. But until then, they will not be able to shut out the sights and sounds and smells of poverty from their daily walks, nor to feel sure from day to day that its most violent and fatal evils will not reach them through their strongest police guards. Besides, as long as poverty remains possible, we shall never be sure that it will not overtake ourselves. If we dig a pit for others, we may fall into it. If we leave a precipice unfenced, our children may fall over it when they are playing. We see the most innocent and respectable families falling into the unfenced pit of poverty every day. And how do we know that it will not be our turn next? It is perhaps the greatest folly of which a nation can be guilty to attempt to use poverty as a sort of punishment for offenses that it does not send the people to prison for. It is easy to say of a lazy man, "Oh, let him be poor. It serves him right for being lazy. It'll teach him a lesson." In saying so, we are ourselves too lazy to think a little before we lay down the law. We cannot afford to have poor people anyhow, whether they be lazy or busy, drunken or sober, virtuous or vicious, thrifty or careless, wise or foolish. If they deserve to suffer, let them be made to suffer in some other way. For mere poverty will not hurt them half as much as it will hurt their innocent neighbors. It is a public nuisance as well as a private misfortune. Its toleration is a national crime. We must therefore take it as an indispensable condition of a sound distribution of wealth that everyone must have a share sufficient to keep her or him from poverty. This is not altogether new. Ever since the days of Queen Elizabeth, it has been the law of England that nobody must be abandoned to destitution. If anyone, however undeserving, applies for relief to the guardians of the poor as a destitute person, the guardians must feed and clothe and house that person. They may do it reluctantly and unkindly. They may attach to the relief the most unpleasant and degrading conditions they can think of. They may set the pauper to hateful, useless work if he is able-bodied, and have him sent to prison if he refuses to do it. The shelter they give him may be that of a horrible general workhouse, in which the old and the young, the sound and the diseased, the innocent girl and lad, and the hardened prostitute and tramp are herded together promiscuously to contaminate one another. They can attach a social stigma to the relief by taking away the pauper's vote, if he has one, and making him incapable of feeling certain public offices or being elected to certain public authorities. They may, in short, drive the deserving and respectable poor to endure any extremity rather than ask for relief. But they must relieve the destitute willy-nilly if they do ask for it. To that extent, the law of England is, as its root, a communistic law, or the harshnesses and wickednesses with which it is carried out are gross mistakes. Because instead of saving the country from the degradation of poverty, they actually make poverty more degrading than it need be. But still, the principle is there. Queen Elizabeth said that nobody must die of starvation and exposure. After the terrible experience we have had of the effects of poverty on the whole nation, rich or poor, must go further and say that nobody must be poor. As we divide up our wealth day by day, the first charge on it must be enough for everybody to be fairly respectable and well-to-do. If they do anything or leave anything undone that gives grounds for saying that they do not deserve it, let them be restrained from doing it or compelled to do it in whatever way restrain or compel evildoers of any other sort. But do not let them, as poor people, make everyone else suffer for their shortcomings. Granted that people should not on any account be allowed to be poor, we have still to consider whether they should be allowed to be rich. When poverty is gone, shall we tolerate luxury and extravagance? This is a poser because it is much easier to say what poverty is than what luxury is. When a woman is hungry or ragged, or has not at least one properly furnished room all to herself to sleep in, then she is clearly suffering from poverty. When the infant mortality in one district is much greater than in another, when the average age of death for fully grown persons in it falls far short of the scriptural 70, when the average weight of the children who survive is below that reached by well-fed and well-cared-for children, then you can say confidently that the people in that district are suffering from poverty. But suffering from riches is not so easily measured. That rich people do suffer a great deal is plain enough to anyone who has an intimate knowledge of their lives. They are so unhealthy that they are always running after cures and surgical operations of one sort or another. When they are not really ill, they imagine they are. They are worried by their property, by their servants, by their poor relations, by their investments, by the need for keeping up their social position, and when they have several children, by the impossibility of leaving these children enough to enable them to live as they have been brought up to live. For we must not forget that if a married couple with 50,000 a year have 5 children, they can leave only 10,000 a year to each after bringing them up to live at the rate of 50,000 and launching them into the sort of society that lives at that rate. The result being that unless these children can make rich marriages, they live beyond their incomes, not knowing how to live more cheaply, and are presently head over ears in debt. They hand on their costly habits and rich friends and debts to their children with very little else, so that the trouble becomes worse and worse from generation to generation. And this is how we meet everywhere with ladies and gentlemen who have no means of keeping up their position and are therefore much more miserable than the common poor. Perhaps you know some well off families who do not seem to suffer from their riches. They do not overeat themselves, they find occupations to keep themselves in health. They do not worry about their position. They put their money into safe investments and are content with a lower rate of interest. And they bring up their children to live simply and do useful work. But this means that they do not live like rich people at all, and might therefore just as well have ordinary incomes. The general run of rich people do not know what to do with themselves, and the end of it is that they have to join a round of social duties and pleasures, mostly manufactured by West End shopkeepers, and so tedious that at the end of a fashionable season, the rich are more worn out than their servants and tradesmen. They may have no taste for sport, but they are forced by their social position to go to the great race meetings and ride to hounds. They may have no taste for music, but they have to go to the opera and to the fashionable concerts. They may not dress as they please, nor do what they please. Because they are rich, they must do what all the other rich people are doing, there being nothing else for them to do except work, which would immediately reduce them to the condition of ordinary people. So, as they cannot do what they like, they must contrive to like what they do and imagine that they are having a splendid time of it when they are in fact being bored by their amusements, humbugged by their doctors, pillaged by their tradesmen, and forced to console themselves unamiably for being snubbed by richer people by snubbing poor people. To escape this boredom, the able and energetic spirits go into parliament or into the diplomatic service or into the army, or manage and develop their estates and investments instead of leaving them to solicitors and stockbrokers and agents, or explore unknown countries with great hardship and risk to themselves, with the result that their lives are not different from the lives of the people who have to do these things for a living. Thus, riches are thrown away on them. And if it were not for the continual dread of falling into poverty, which haunts us all at present, they would refuse to be bothered with much property. The only people who get any special satisfaction out of being richer than others are those who enjoy being idle and like to fancy that they are better than their neighbors and be treated as if they were. But no country can afford to pamper snobbery. Laziness and vanity are not virtues to be encouraged. They are vices to be suppressed. Besides, the desire to be idle and lazy and able to order poor people about, could not be satisfied, even if it were right to satisfy it, if there were no poor people to order about. What we should have would be not poor people and rich people, but simply people with enough and people with more than enough. And that brings up at least the naughty question: what is enough? In Shakespeare's famous play King Lear and his daughters have an argument about this. His idea of enough is having 100 knights to wait on him. His eldest daughter thinks that 50 would be enough. Her sister does not see what he wants with any knights at all, when her servants can do all he needs for him. Leah retorts that if she cuts life down to what cannot be done without, she had better throw away her fine clothes, as she would be warmer in a blanket. And to this she has no answer. Nobody can say what is enough. What is enough for a gypsy is not enough for a lady, and what is enough for one lady leaves another very discontented. When once you get above the poverty line, there's no reason why you should stop there. With modern machinery, we can produce much more than enough to feed, clothe, and house us decently. There is no end to the number of new things we can get into the habit of using, or to the improvements we can make in the things we already use. Our grandmothers managed to get on without gas cookers, electric light, motor cars, and telephones. But today, these things are no longer curiosities and luxuries. They are matter of course necessities, and nobody who cannot afford them is considered well off. In the same way, the standard of education and culture has risen. Nowadays, a parlor maid as ignorant as Queen Victoria was when she came to the throne would be classed as mentally defective. As Queen Victoria managed to get on very well in spite of her ignorance, it cannot be said that the knowledge in which the parlor maid has the advantage over her is a necessity of a civilized life any more than a telephone is. But civilized life and highly civilized life are different. What is enough for one is not enough for the other. Take a half civilized girl into a house, and though she may be stronger and more willing and good natured than many highly civilized girls are, she will smash everything that will not stand the roughest handling. She will be unable to take or send written messages. And as to understanding or using such civilized contrivances as watches, baths, sewing machines, and electric heaters and sweepers, you will be fortunate if you can induce her to turn off a tap instead of leaving the water running. And your civilized maid who can be trusted with all these things would be like a bull in a china shop If she were let loose in the laboratories where highly trained scientific workers use machines and instruments of such delicacy that their movements are as invisible as that of the hour hands of our clocks, handling and controlling poisons and explosives of the most dangerous kind, or in the operating rooms where surgeons have to do things in which a slip of the hand might prove fatal. If every housemaid had the delicacy of touch, the knowledge, and the patience that are needed in the laboratories and operating theaters, where they are unfortunately not always forthcoming, the most wonderful changes could be made in our housekeeping. We could not only have the present work done much more quickly, perfectly, and cleanly, but we could do a great deal that is now quite impossible. Now it costs more to educate and train a laboratory worker than a housemaid, and more to train a housemaid than to catch a savage. What is enough in one case is not enough in another. Therefore, to ask boldly how much is enough to live on is to ask an unanswerable question. It all depends on what sort of life you propose to live. What is enough for the life of a tramp is not enough for a highly civilized life, with its personal refinement and its atmosphere of music, art, literature, religion, science, and philosophy. Of these things, we can never have enough. There is always something new to be discovered, and something old to be bettered. In short, there is no such thing as enough civilization, though there may be enough of any particular thing like bread or boots at any particular moment. If being poor means wanting something more and something better than we have, and it is hard to say what else feeling poor means, then we shall always feel poor no matter how much money we have, because though we may have enough of this thing or of that thing, we shall never have enough of everything. Consequently, if it be proposed to give some people enough and others more than enough, the scheme will break down. For all the money will be used up before anybody will be content. Nobody will stop asking for more for the sake of setting up and maintaining a fancy class of pampered persons who, after all, will be even more discontented than their poorer neighbors. The only way out of this difficulty is to give everybody the same, which is the socialist solution of the distribution problem. But you may tell me that you're prepared to swallow this difficulty rather than swallow socialism. Most of us begin like that. What converts us is the discovery of the terrible array of evils around us and dangers in front of us, which we dare not ignore. You may be unable to see any beauty in equality of income, but the least idealistic woman can see the disasters of inequality when the evils with which she is herself in daily conflict are traced to it. And I am now going to show you the connection.